Hello, hello. Okay. No, right. I won't do that. Uh, um, oops. No. You know, um, okay. How do I do that? Good morning, Hallett. On screen or whatever. I guess I could sheet type or yeah, sheet type, so I'll type. So it's 10:42. We're gonna wait a few minutes. Morning, Sarah. What's that?
5 more weeks. So like, I thought it was less.
It is less. 10, 11, 12, 13. Right.
And then maybe.
Including this week.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is Tuesday. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. What program are you in, Sarah? Right. I keep wondering if that's 1, 2, or 3 things. But.
All of the above. All of the above.
And where in the what year? What semester are you in?
I'm in my 8th semester.
Oh, wow.
Last year.
Wow.
Yeah. Is this your final semester? Yeah. Okay, congrats. Thanks.
Wow.
If you go. If you go.
Nah, with your luck, we'll get rid of crime. That's what I mean. I wouldn't worry about that part of it. I don't think we're going to be able to we'll be getting rid of crime anytime soon. You'll be able to retire. What kind of work is there in that field? So,
Doing like a specialty within policing, some gangs, homicide, whatever, sexual.
oh, right.
And then I go from doing just police work or security or private sector, so like private investigator, or I can go into like emergency management,
Huh.
and that's kind of
But data security, that kind of thing too, or is that a different
No,
field?
I kind of like brought it up with my chair, or not the chair, but like the head of the program. So I was like, you like emergency management is within public safety. So I did my co-op with emergency management to like show them that this is still public safety. You still like
Show who? Show the work people or to show the college
show
people?
the college, because like,
Right.
oh, like, I don't know if that's gonna be a good co-op for you. Like
The college people said that. Wow. Good for you. Huh.
it's not analysis, but I'm like, but I still did mapping. Like, that's part of my program.
Right.
Still did like interactions with like different communities and police.
Yeah.
And all of that. So then they're like, okay, I kind of see it. Kind of got them to see like you can actually do analysis in emergency management, and then that's what I'm doing my capstone on. Is that like, and crime analysts could be in a team of emergency management people, and then they can help build like maps for crimes, and then help like show that there is more crimes when there's an emergency happening. So
Oh, I see. Right. I lost track of the crime part and focused just on the analysis part, but now I see. Right.
And then like we can find hot spots of where like crimes happen the most within a province when an emergency happens, and then we can help try and
Right.
protect community while protecting them from the emergency itself.
Right.
I imagine your capstone, you just having a thing,
I did focus on that in my literature review, but I'm kind of focusing more on the ice storm. I'm kind of focusing on one emergency and then trying to build that up because I was more time finding data.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, so like I could like at Toronto Police was the only people that I could get data from.
Well, okay, I see. Right.
I called Calgary, I called Edmonton, I called Vancouver. Like I had all these like different like natural disasters in mind that I wanted to do, but I couldn't get any data for them.
Right, because a reasonable initial hypothesis would be criminals are going to take advantage of the
the
down
vulnerable
systems.
sector.
And
Yeah, because they're all vulnerable right now. So
right.
yeah, that's what I'm trying to.
Is your final paper due in April?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's mine. Good luck.
Thanks. Yeah.
Sure. And it's do that program require? Do all the programs require a capstone? Do all the degree I don't think so. I didn't think so either. Yeah.
Certain, it depends on what bachelor's you're doing.
Right.
I know behavioral science and art are like kind of connected for capstones.
Yeah, it feels more like if you're in a humanity or humanity related sector, like I know for cosmetic science, they have a capstone, but they're pure science, right?
Yeah.
But like,
Cosmetic science has a degree program now.
I don't know if it's a degree
Oh,
program, I
okay.
just know they have a capstone.
Right. Well, because capstone, can you really do a capstone in a 4-semester? I guess you could.
You could, but like, good luck. It sounds fascinating. Sounds great.
Yeah. Trying to make a static map of like showing before the emergency and then during the whole week.
So you take mapping courses?
Yeah, I
you
did
must.
mapping courses, and then I got A's in that. Yeah, you have to do that.
Is that a required course or like, so everybody who graduates with your credential has to have their black belt or brown belt anyway in mapping?
Yeah.
Right. Makes sense. And that there's a lot of change in the technology of that, right? So in 5 years,
It could be very
it'll be very different.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Then there's no way to.
There's no way to, yeah. I kind of just was like, look, like, I can do all these requirements, and there were certain requirements for our placement, and I was like, I can do like 10 out of 15. And they're like, you know what, that's better than nothing. And they don't even allow security anymore as a code.
As a goal.
Yeah, I'm like, but security is part of our program.
Right, but I suspect that that's because they've had bad experience with security companies where they just get the students to be schmucks and fetch coffee or just be,
Yeah.
and so that's useless, worse really than useless.
Yeah.
Okay, so today I'm going to try to do two things interconnected to each other. There's going to be some overlap. I'm using the same slides as one of the videos that I put on for the day where I was sick. So there's some overlap, but that's the way the social sciences work anyway. And I want to, okay, so I'll just get started. So good morning, everyone out in the, now where did the, that's, am I sharing my screen? I do not know. That is a super good question. Now, how do I, okay, share screen. There. Okay, out there in synchronous land, can you tell me, can someone tell me if you see the PowerPoint presentation? Of course, I don't know how to check.
Yeah, we can see it.
Oh, okay. So someone can. Yes. Okay, so two people can see it. Puzzling. Who is it who can't see it? So, okay, so we'll move forward then. I don't know what else I could do, but so this is the plan for today. That's in the way. I'll move that over here. Okay. So as I was just explaining to our colleagues in class, I'm going to cover, I want to articulate in more detail and provide some examples of dialectic as I understand it and as I believe Bowder understands it. And in particular, I want to compare I want to compare Bowder's approach to Treblecock and Kelly's approach. I think Bowder's approach to understanding immigration fills in some gaps that are left over from as a consequence of, as a necessary consequence even, of Treblecock and Kelly's theoretical framework. And also, I want to illustrate for you, I want to demonstrate to you what the final part of the group literature review project entails. So we're going to do group literature review. Then we're going to take a look at Hegel and dialectical materialism. And then we'll take a look at the differences between the making of the mosaic and the immigration dialectic. So the first thing I want to call to your attention is everybody needs to be able to work with Adobe Acrobat, and the college through your Seneca registration, you have access to Adobe's Creative Cloud suite. So I'm going to go to that now. That's okay. So how do I make that bigger though? Okay. So on the PowerPoint presentation, I have this link, and the link will take you to this place where there are where there's a sign in and install Adobe Creative Cloud instructions and so on. And I won't take you through those steps, partly because every time I try this, I bungle it. And so I somehow have managed to get it on my computer. And I take that as evidence that anybody can. So all of you, either already have or at least can. And it's a requirement. So I understand, I believe, I know that there are other ways of opening Adobe files and so on. And as long as the end product that your group produces meets all of the other requirements, then that's fine. What I want is I want one document from each group. And then I'll describe a little bit what that document's going to look like. Well, what it's going to look like is the combining of, if there are 5 people in your group, you will have chosen 5 articles, and your final submission will be one document that includes each of those articles. So it'll be 5 articles combined into one document. And with the Adobe Creative Cloud suite, you have that technical capability. It's possible that everybody always everywhere can do that. I'm not sure, but it won't be a good explanation. It won't be a sufficient explanation that you couldn't do it, because I know that if you do it this way, you have that capability, that software capability. And so instead of having me open a dozen different things, and part of the way these courses prepare you for the real world is, in the real world, in general anyway, your boss doesn't care why you couldn't get something done. If your boss wants you to get something done, you need to get it done. And in a certain kind of way, I'm simulating your boss. I want to make sure that it's possible for you. I have made sure that it's possible for you, at least this way. If you can get it done some other way, that's the main thing. But I want one document from each group that is the combination, the addition of all of the different articles that you've chosen. Now, what is it you're going to do with those articles? So that's what I want to take a look at now. But I think I forgot to open. Okay, here it is. Yes, I did. I need to add one. I made last minute changes. Okay, I'll just be 1 second here. What's going on? Okay, there we go. The content files. Okay, sorry about this. Now, how do I find myself? Okay. We're nearly there. Okay, here we go. So this is the description. Jesus Christ. No. Okay, there. Enable editing. So this is the description of the group submission. So this part, this is part of the assignment that will require, I'll just read it and then we're going to do it in a minute. So I'll open a document and then I'll make some annotations and I'll demonstrate to you and hopefully with you what that's going to look like in practice. So this is part of the assignment that will require group interaction. For each of the articles you will have chosen, 3 of the members of your group have to make comments on the articles using the markup function in the PDF tool. So we'll take a look exactly at what I mean by that. The commentary that you are to provide has to focus on the connections you can find between the articles you've chosen and a specified, clearly articulated aspect of the ideas, interests, institutions, framework as laid out in the first reading, or on a dialectical response to some part of that framework. Okay, so let's turn to an article. But how do I get there? I've put some articles in here that we're going to take a look at. Okay. So can you see on the screen an article whose title is "Interests Aren't Everything: An Exploration of Economic Explanations, etc." Okay, Stazel.
Yes.
First,
Yes.
so yes, you can see it. So Stazel, excellent question. No, each group provides 3 different sets of commentaries on all of the articles. In the people in the group have to organize yourselves. And so presumably what you'll do is everyone has their own article. You'll comment on your article, and then you'll comment on other articles. And for each of the articles, there has to be comments from 3 different people. Now, one of the things that we're going to take a look at, so I want to download this, and then I want to open it in. Oh, here we go. No. Okay, so how do I maximize this? Okay. So I found this article this morning and I started reading it, and it better be there. I highlighted this part. So on page 4 of the article, one of the subsections begins with the following claim: to understand the origins and outcomes of public policy, one must navigate the delicate balance between interests and ideas. Interest-oriented explanations of public policy suggest that they originate in the material or economic advantages that an individual or group will gain from a law. This is a clear statement, an alternative equivalent version of the way that Treblecock and Kelly describe how they understand interests to operate in their interests idea framework. And so here, the comment I added, I didn't add a comment there. I added a comment on the second place. So later in the article, there's they have the following claim: another way to measure the policy influence of economic actors is to explore the public opinions and demands of business leaders. Our analysis concluded that in nearly 95% of the public statements, the private sector engaged in at least one, but frequently all 3 of the following activities. And so this is evidence provided by the authors of this article that business interests made an effort to shift this. This article is about the state of Utah in the United States. So in Utah, and they use Utah as a kind of sample case to demonstrate their overall thesis. And the overall thesis is captured in this case in the title. That's not always the case, but in the title is interests aren't everything. And so they demonstrate that although the business interests seek certain kinds of things, that it doesn't always, but the point I want to illustrate for you is what your answer is going to look like, what your submission is going to look like. So if this article had been one of the articles your group had picked out, then and I was one of the people in the group, I would read through it and then I would highlight this. And what I want to call to your attention first is that because I've registered, my name shows up in the panel. If for whatever reason, so I need to see the name in the panel. What I don't want is, and what I'm afraid has happened in the past, and it is where you just divide the labor up and you pretend to do what I've asked you to do. I don't blame anyone or anything like that. That's more or less on me. And so in this iteration of this assignment, my solution is to have, I think that this will work. We'll find out that when everyone registers for the Adobe, then their name, their sort of corporate identity for the purpose of the registration in the Adobe gets automatically included in the panel where you add your comments. So I want to show you now how to generate these. I imagine all of you already know this, but I want to make sure that I go through it with you. So I'll just pick any particular place. So one way of doing it, there may be other ways, I'm not sure, but you bold a passage by clicking on your mouse, and then you can bold a passage that way. And then when you right click on it, you have a number of options. And one of the options is to highlight the text. So you click on highlight, and then once it's highlighted, and so you can change the color of the highlights. That's one strategy you have. But the main thing I want to call to your attention is when you right click on a passage that you will have already highlighted, you then have the option of opening a pop-up, what's it called? I forget what it's pop-up, open pop-up note. So you click on that, and then a little box opens and you type your comment in there. So now I want to go back to I want to take a look at the comment. I don't know how easily it is going to be to see. So what I wrote in the comment, and I can make it a bit bigger. So this is very similar to the point made by Treblecock and Kelly on page 10 of The Making of the Mosaic. And then I quote a passage from the reading. So it's not going to be enough to get a top grade that you just remember that at some point something came up. You need to make an explicit connection between the passage in the article and either a PowerPoint slide from one of the lectures or a passage in the reading that I signed, or the other option is one of the other articles that you will have included in your group literature review. And there are a couple of purposes that this assignment serves. I want to demonstrate to you in a kind of tangible way a feature of how the social sciences operate, how they function, and in particular how they generate knowledge. They generate knowledge against the background, against the assumed background of a network of already articulated knowledge claims where there's a great deal of overlap, but also some disagreement. I'm not sure I've used this metaphor in this class before, but I've used it elsewhere all over the place. In engineering, nobody, or in physics and engineering and hydrology, nobody ever writes articles about water going downhill. Not because nobody believes that water goes downhill, but the very opposite. Everyone knows water goes downhill, so nobody bothers to write about it. What people do bother to write about are things where, at least in some respect or from some perspective, reasonable people might disagree about. And so here, what their article is about, let me just get back to a more workable size here. The article is interests aren't everything. The reason they're writing the article is that there's a great deal of social scientific work, a very strong methodological commitment to the view that interests are everything. Almost nobody ever flat out makes the claim that the only social reality is business or profit or something along those lines. But a great deal of social scientific work is produced that derives all kinds of more or less relevant and helpful conclusions on the exploring the extent to which interests, even though they may not be absolutely everything, account for a great deal. Here they're arguing, and they, I had it earlier, but they make the point that in particular in analyzing policy, there are a number of policy areas, especially clearly in the context of US academic writing, that are argued to be, to a very large extent, explainable in terms of the material interests of the different groups at work. And so they, at one point, they write that in terms of energy policy and healthcare policy, a great deal of government policy, state level policy and national level policy can be explained and even predicted by analyzing the various material interests in play. But as they say in that first quote that I identified here, to understand the origins and outcomes of public policy, one must navigate the delicate balance between interests and ideas. So mirroring the claim that Trebilcock and Kelly make. And in Trebilcock and Kelly's case, they're not claiming that this is original work of theirs. They are claiming to be participating in a widely used framework in other policy areas, and they want to pursue the advantages of that framework in order to explain a particular subset of the policy world, namely Canadian immigration policy. And so in this one contribution, so I've given you an example and I've shown you how to produce it. You open the document in Adobe, you find the passage that you think you can use to complete the requirements of the assignment. You block the passage by holding down the left mouse, and then you right click it, you highlight the text, and then you open a pop-up note, and then you describe the nature of the connection as you see it between that particular claim in this article and a particular claim made elsewhere in the course, either in one of the other articles that you've seen, in one of the assigned readings, in a PowerPoint, in a lecture, so that if you want, if you're going to do this, I can't imagine it, but you go back and you listen to one of the lectures, they're all recorded. And so you can make a connection that way. So Mishika asks, to be clear, we are uploading each of the articles we found. And then there's this, that's super unhelpful. God. Okay, there. To be clear, we are uploading each of the articles we found in one PDF document, and then each group member makes comments. Not quite. I mean, you're allowed to do it that way. I need comments from 3 different people on each of the articles. How you divide that work up amongst yourselves is up to you. But what I need as identified. So if it'd be, I'm Antoine Boulem, and then there'd be Joe Smith and Imran Khan would be the other people, and they would have their comments there. And so you need to do that. Now, the last, let's go back to the description of the assignment. I'm going to make this bigger so I can see it. Okay, so this is not quite the final version of this. So there's gonna I'm gonna need 5 comments per person per document. So you need to find 5 words or sentences or places in the article that you can connect to other components in the course. So I'll add that. So 15 comments per paper. 3 commenters, 5 comments each. So that's 15 comments. That's more than I need. Let's say 3 each, 3 comments per person. So 9 comments per article. So each person has to find 3 different places. Yeah, I'm thinking more for me than you actually, but yes, for you also, I suppose. 3 each will suffice. I'm going to post this a little bit later today. No, I won't. I'll post this later. But for now, the main thing I want to do is for you to see how to do it in Adobe Blackboard and what the final assignment's going to look like. And so, I beg your pardon? Adobe, is it Acrobat? I don't even know. Oh, no, not Blackboard. No, Adobe Acrobat. Yes. Adobe Acrobat. Yes, exactly. Yep. Yes, right. Yeah. I don't want you to just pick the pages where you have the comments. I want the entirety of the article and then, yes. So, yeah, right. And actually, I wonder if that's what I'll do. Now, did I open the second article? Because I'll show you how to combine them. Week 10. Download. Save. And then if you click on tools, one of the options is combine files. Oh my God. Well, that's not a good thing. What the hell? Okay, well, that's a problem. Okay, I'm gonna have to figure this out. On my laptop, somehow at some point, the Adobe thing works fine to combine the files, but it seems, let's try this, my apps. Adobe Acrobat, where did we go? Do you already have Adobe Acrobat on your machines? No. Okay. It doesn't seem like naturally. God, okay, here we go. What's this? Okay, so wait a minute.
You're basically logging into a
Okay.
Okay.
Cause I can't get my apps.
Okay, so I think you might have to register with Adobe, but you get it free with your Seneca credentials. But I'm not going to go through it right now. I will find out about it though. I'm just going to make a little note to myself to make sure I send an email to find out. Just 2 seconds here so I don't leave this.
And only one group member has to create the file. Or should everyone create
I
the
mean,
file?
if you're sharing it for people to have comments, you might need to.
Oh, yeah.
So, but I mean, one student can create it, and it probably makes sense for just one student to create it and then to share it. So you create it and then you send that file to everybody, and then you, as a group, will have decided, well, the three of us will do Article 1, and however you're going to decide to divide the labor, you come to that decision, and then you make your comments on the files you're required to make comments on, and then between you make sure that you've submitted the required work. So I'm writing myself a note here, but I'm not typing on the right keyboard. Okay, so I'm going to get some instruction from IT to make sure that all of this is available, and hopefully there's a video either on YouTube or assembled by the library that I can send to everybody to make sure, because in my experience anyway, and management has told me this, and in this case, I'm sure they're right, that while lots of students are good, very capable technologically, not everybody is, first of all, and secondly, I'm not asking you to be good in general. I'm asking you to do this one specific thing. So it's up to me to make sure that everyone can do this one specific thing. Even if you are a genius at coding, if you don't know how to do this, then it might be too late. So, okay. So I will assemble that information about how to register with the Adobe suite of tools, so that you have available to you the particular technical requirements to combine the files, to save all the files with all of the different comments. Okay, so now, are there questions about, other than the technical side of it, are there questions about this final phase of the assignment?
We can comment on our own article and then
Hi,
comment
Professor.
so on and so forth.
Hello.
Yes, that's one option. Okay, so someone's saying something, yeah?
I just wanted to clarify, for this assignment, do you need like the articles themselves, or can we use, like, for example, the literature review? I just want to be clear.
The article, so for this assignment, you're working in the groups that have already been set up,
Mm-hmm.
and each group has submitted a works cited list with an account of what it is that those articles all share.
Mm-hmm.
Then each group submitted an annotated bibliography of those articles. And this last stage of the assignment, you're going to write comments on those same articles that you submitted in the first 2 stages of this overall assignment. And so what your submission is going to be, each group will submit one large-ish PDF file that will be made up of 4, 5, or 6 articles, depending on how many people are in your group. And each one of those articles will include 9 comments, 3 comments from 3 different students in your group on those articles.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. It's a weird thing when something's clear in your head, and sometimes it's hard to make sense of questions for people for legitimate questions that people who don't yet have it clear in their head what's going on. So all you need to, what the comments need to do is demonstrate to me that you've understood what the sentence you've identified in that paragraph that you've bolded, what it means, and how, at least in one version of it, that there's some connection between what that sentence means or says or asks about or disagrees with, or and so on, and some other part of the course, some other specifiable, identifiable part of the course. Mostly what I have in mind is in those 2 extended readings, the Trebilcock and Kelly or the Bowder, but absolutely on an equal footing from a grade point of view and all that from other articles in that among those articles that you will have submitted. Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And yes. And so, but you will be expected and your grade will reflect spelling and proper sentence construction and clarity and so on. Okay, so any further questions? If not, what we're going to do is I'm going to take a quick break and then I will come back and we will keep moving forward on the rest of the material that I'd planned for today. And over the course of the next couple of hours, of course, if you think of a new question, you can certainly just post it or turn your microphone on, or if you're in class, ask me in class, and we can go back to it now. Let me see. Did someone new come in? No. Okay, so I'm going to step out of the classroom for 2 or 3 minutes, and I will be back and we'll carry on with the dialectic.
This is who's doing this part.
I know, I'm about to say it. I have like.
Yeah. I mean, like the group, like who's writing on which paragraph and or what, not paragraph, but article, that way. We're like, who's
just-
doing what?
If anybody from my group is out there, I'm sorry for the message I'm about to send out. What's your connection? That's not a connection.
I know.
Immigration, that's the course.
I know.
Did you get good mark back for the recent one?
Yeah, he said good job. That was it.
That was great.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to get started again. So now this is a diagram from Statistics Canada. I think that it's not completely up to date. It's nearly completely up to date. I think there may be one or two added categories up here. And I know that it's in the work, but I want to take a look at that diagram in order to try to demonstrate to you the difference, what it is that a dialectical approach, how it is that a dialectical approach differs from the approach that Treblecock and Kelly in fact practice, and also different from the model that Treblecock and Kelly, the way they describe the theory on the basis of which they do what it is they've done. And so we have, broadly speaking, three categories, although there are four shades. For the most part, the way immigration policy is analyzed by academics, and also the way the Department of the ministry itself and the Ministry of Justice describe it. There's three classes: economic, family, and then refugee and other immigrants. Largely speaking, these are humanitarian considerations as opposed to other sorts of considerations. And it's the relationship between these different categories that needs to be explained, the policy justifications for the different balances among these classes of immigrants that needs to be explained. When we take a look at the history of Canada from 1867 until this afternoon, it's only after World War II that the third category exists, first of all. So refugees as the legal category in international law emerge out of World War II, after World War II. The other two categories, economic immigrant and immigrant sponsored by family, these two categories call on competing kinds of explanations and justifications. And it's the nature of the competition among the explanations and justifications where a dialectical approach, I'm arguing and Bowder argues, and a number of other people who I haven't and won't mention have argued, provides a more complete explanation and a better model for trying to understand what has gone on, and for people who are interested in this, trying to influence what will go on. Okay, so these are the official categories. Now, so and we see over the course of slightly longer than from a bit before Confederation, that the number of immigrants landing annually in Canada has varied tremendously. And broadly speaking, from a very wide social scientific kind of question, the initial research question is, are there any factors that we can identify and isolate that explain in some way or other the wide variation in the number of people who land annually in Canada? Now, it's a plausible hypothesis that, as far as I know, nobody disagrees with, that whatever the answer is going to be, it's going to have to include something about where the immigrants are coming from and something about what's going on in Canada. And so in the 1850s, part of these spikes are attributable to the famine in Ireland. And so something was going on in Ireland, the causes of which themselves are complicated and so on, but there's something was going on in Ireland that pushed people out of Ireland. And likewise, in different, some of these spikes correlate with international events or national events in other countries, leading them to leave their country. In the 1970s, and this spike here is partly associated with the Vietnamese, the end of the Vietnam War, and the increased number of refugee claimants leaving Vietnam for, among other things, Canada, but the United States and Europe as well. And so a number of these spikes, a number of these valleys are associated with other kinds of events, geopolitical events or economic events. This crater here corresponds to the Great Depression and then World War II. And so there are clear combination of events, internal and external, that correlate with the numbers of people who land annually in Canada. And the cognitive task of the social sciences is to try to provide a logically and empirically rigorous account of the correlation of these events. It doesn't really tell us enough to simply identify that two things happened at the same time. That gives us no explanatory purchase on the past, and even more importantly, gives us zero guidance for what we should do in the future or for what we should do right now. We need to understand the correlation between different variables if we're going to make a plan or if we're going to try to fix a problem. I beg your pardon? Right, yes, exactly. Okay, so, right, so let's move on here to now. Now, in comparing Bowder's book to Treblecock's book, I want you to be clear before you try to think about those two accounts. Try to compare those two accounts. These are not apples to apples comparisons. Bowder did not try to do a better job at what he thought Treblecock and Kelly were doing. He was writing a different book, looking at different aspects of largely the same set of phenomena. He was specifically interested in how does the shape of the way the news media cover international migration issues, on the one hand in Germany, on the other hand in Canada, help us to understand the relationship between the national imaginary, our consciousness. It's a difficult notion. It's a squishy notion. It's one thing to measure. I mean, it takes plenty of work to figure out, say, the average blood pressure of Canadians between the age of 60 and 65 who live in towns between 50,000 people and 75,000 people. That's a hard enough question to deal with, but mostly it's just about gathering data. The question Bowder's interested in is a more difficult question. How do people who live in Canada of a certain legal status feel about their membership in that community? And so the difficulty of the question dictates that there are going to be only, and at best, tentative answers. But the media is one place to look at. It's fairly clear, or it's at least a plausible initial hypothesis that if we take a look at how national media cover particular stories, we're going to get some kind of idea of at least one of the inputs into the attitudes of the people in that national community about the events that those stories are stories of. And so I took this quote from a different source just to highlight that Bowder is covering territory that's recognized by other social scientists, by other academics, to be at least by some other academics, it's a thing that he's looking at, that lots of other people in relevantly similar contexts and also interestingly different contexts also look at. And so the quote has it, over the course of the 20th century, and even more than ever at the dawn of the 21st century, this reality, the reality of our social imaginary, has been defined by the mass media, which have in many ways usurped the traditional role of family, friends, and religion in shaping how we make sense of the events and experiences of our daily lives, so much so that we risk thinking of our mediated existence and the particular form it has taken under global capitalism as somehow natural or inevitable. Well, the last part, although I think it's true, it's not the main part. It's that in our contemporary world, at least some social scientists claim, and I think in our everyday lives, we run into some version of that claim that you just need to go around and look at just observe in the hallways 3-4 people standing together talking to each other. Very often they'll be facing each other and they'll be looking at their phones, so that as they're having face-to-face interactions, they're also actively on their phone having other kinds of interactions. That, I mean, it couldn't happen 20 years ago, because phones didn't do that. Phones just, you could talk on a phone. But I would say 20 years ago, it wouldn't really have made sense to be in a conversation with your friend and also talking on your phone at the same time, like, maybe in some emergency thing. But in general, our understanding of and our practice of having personal contact with other people precluded. Either I'm having a chat with you or I'm texting or I'm on the phone. Now that's not the case, right? You people my age, people your age, people younger will be blabbing, and then some stupid cat picture will come up and they'll have to type something hilarious back because they can't help themselves. It's part of the fabric of how we operate, or it seems like it's increasingly part of the fabric of how we operate in the 21st century. Bowder picks a subsection of that context, the news media, to examine ways in which it connects to the sense that people in Canada have of being Canadian and the sense that people in Germany have of being German. And he compares the two for a variety of reasons that needn't concern us for today. So we started the course, we started the course 2 years ago from this quote. I'm not 100% sure I started it exactly, but we looked at this at the very beginning of the course, or near the very beginning of the course. In this book, and this book is the Making of the Mosaic, the story of Canadian immigration policies told from the perspective of the major participants involved in the different stages of the policy's evolution. We've tried to avoid the temptation to be judgmental about their moral characteristics from the comfortable vantage point or supposedly enhanced sensibilities of the contemporary social and intellectual milieu. However, a reflective re-examination of our collective past reveals a set of core normative and ethical values that have been fundamental in the making of the Canadian mosaic, and when rendered explicit, provide perspective on the central issues of immigration policy that confront us today and will do so in the future. Just stay on top of my thing here. So the claim of the mosaic is that there's this tension between the way the different interests, the different groups of people in Canada who interpret their position in Canada to depend in some identifiable respect on immigration policy, either on absolute levels or which groups will be included, which groups will be excluded. And it's easy enough or difficult enough, I guess, depending on how you look at it, but it's a doable thing to try to connect a specific group to its interests, to its material interests, and to see how those material interests might be thought to depend to some degree, at least, on immigration policy. So that if you're Irish and you identify as Irish, and there's a problem in Ireland, you want the Canadian government to allow more Irish people to come into Canada, and likewise replace Irish with any other community. It doesn't have to be a national community. It could be a religious community. It could be in the 1850s, I'm pretty sure this wasn't on, but since the 1970s, and certainly much more since, I don't know, more recently, the LGBTQ plus community has actively lobbied, not always especially successfully, but has actively lobbied the federal government to respond to varying conditions in other parts of the world where the LGBTQ community has been targeted by the national or local level governments in those places around the world. And same with all kinds of different communities have, under crisis situations, mobilized or lobbied at least the government to try to extend Canada's background position as an immigrant country, to open its doors a little wider than it otherwise might for people that these groups see as part of them. That's one sort of one material interest that was identified by Treblecock and Kelly. Yeah,
Part of that because there was less lobbying, I guess, or not lobbying, but like there was less of a push of the public thinks this is more the government had other interests at the end of Ukrainian immigrants. Over the past couple years.
so say that again.
Certain lobbyists would have to push the Canadian government to allow certain immigrants in, right? Would you agree that Ukraine is not a part of that because it was more the Canadian government that lobbyists?
No, I think many people in Canada of Ukrainian descent, for sure, lobbied the government. I don't think that was the only cause of the Canadian government doing that. And so initially, we're looking for all of the possible causes. And then after we've identified the possible causes, then we want to start trying to think about and understand the relation among all of those different causes. And so, and the Treblecock and Kelly make the very valid point that often a particular group will identify, will find it a better mechanism to achieve their material goal if they can identify a value that goal pursues. And so the contemporary business groups are often going to say they're in favor of immigration because of diversity and so on, when in fact, other groups, and maybe even privately, people in the business groups will admit that it doesn't hurt that having more immigrants puts downward pressure on wages, that from the business point of view, it's helpful to them. Anything that can keep costs down is good for business. And so if you get both of those things, great. And the government and the business groups understand that they're not likely to get too much help from other groups when they need it, if what they say is we just want to keep wages down. They say other things. And Treblecock and Kelly have identified that. Several of you in different contexts in the discussion boards and so on correctly identified that claim from Treblecock and Kelly. And actually, a couple of you misidentified it, but that's a separate story. So, oh, you're welcome. So, so these core normative and ethical values, the challenge that Treblecock and Kelly have is that these core ethical values can seem at least to conflict with each other. One of the values is the value of human dignity, the value of liberty. Each individual has its own worth, independently of any community that it's part of, independently of any group identification. It's a widely shared belief in Canada and around the world in many, many different places, and only in the modern period, really, but still we are in the modern period, that each life has its own independent moral value, the dignity of the human being as such. It's the foundation of the whole program of human rights. Just because I'm a man, just because you're a woman, just because you're from Lithuania, none of those things are all by themselves a reason for you to be of more value as a human than any of the rest of us. We're all equal in that respect, in the respect of the human dignity of our humanness. And also the competing value is that we here form a community, and that we're absolutely entitled as a community to protect our interests and to create the conditions that are required for our community to thrive as a community. And so those two core values that they've identified, in fact, they stress it in that first chapter, there's a permanent tension between those two core values. And in a certain way, what the book argues is that it's that tension between those two values that explains to a great degree the motion, the fact that the numbers go up and down over time, at least on the Canadian side. Okay, so speaking about this, so in this passage, I want us to, I'm trying to put in place a slow reading that, so about this reflective reexamination, what they want to avoid is allegedly, is the claim that they're making is they want to avoid a comfortable vantage point. So really what they're saying is, I'm glossing it a tiny bit, but I don't think that it's absolutely out of line. They don't want to do what people sometimes say is politically correct. They don't want to fall into a politically correct account of what was going on in 1910. They don't say exactly why they don't want to do that. So they leave that open-ended. In my view, I think from a rhetorical point of view, they're using a very widely used strategy that's very effective. It's effective, and that's irony. But the effectiveness of irony depends on it staying in the background. And so the readers will identify this, and it will, they will, so what they don't do, by being ironic, what they don't do is to make something explicit. There's an internal contradiction at the level of the discourse itself here. You can't be ironic and make everything explicit. They're mutually incompatible. So what is the comfortable vantage point or supposedly enhanced sensibilities of the contemporary social and intellectual milieu? Is it comfortable, and in what ways is it supposed to be enhanced? What do they mean by that? And how are we supposed to be, how could we as readers of this position ourselves in order to be able to either agree or disagree with some aspect or other of the analysis that they're offering? So rather than take this comfortable vantage point, they're claiming that a reflective reexamination of our collective past reflects these core normative values that will allow us to better understand why, under certain circumstances, Canada opened its doors to more migrants, or why, under other circumstances, where the values weren't changing, we closed our doors. And so if we go back to my here, the doors slammed shut right around here. As soon as the business, as soon as wages dropped, as soon as the cost of living went up, as soon as the GDP per capita dropped precipitously in the Great Depression, the number of migrants dropped dramatically. Now, in part, that's because all of a sudden, the resources that were available to the populations that had been coming to Canada also dried up. People were coming from France and England and Germany and Europe primarily, because everyone else was excluded. But where they were coming from also experienced in some ways an even more dramatic change in their material circumstances. And so, whereas it used to be a hardship and a sacrifice that was often met collectively, so that a family would save money, and together they would send one of the brothers or one of the sisters from their village to go and set up in Canada, with the idea that once they're established in Canada, they'll send for the rest of the family. But even that level of sacrifice under the conditions of the Depression became impossible. So there was something going on the other side, but also something going on here. Canada closed its doors, and so the tide stopped, and it's not clear. And given the theoretical resources that are mobilized by Treblecock and Kelly, there's no way to distinguish exactly the push from the pull. In general terms, immigration is analyzed in terms of so-called push factors and pull factors, as though they exist independently of each other. And sometimes they seem to operate independently of each other, but sometimes it's more difficult to be able to be sure about that. Okay, so now. So a reflective reexamination is I think is good, a very brief description of Hegel's dialectic. And so my task, I'm hesitating because it's such a hard topic. Anyway, we'll just jump in. So the combination of a reflective reexamination and the rendering explicit of that reflective reexamination captures what is it captures Hegel's own description of what dialectic is. And Bauder distances himself from the overall Hegelian package, but I think that's because he doesn't really understand. I mean, I think he just doesn't understand Hegel, the bottom line. Hegel is very, very difficult. And there are students of Hegel who do embrace the interpretation of Hegel that Bauder hesitates with, the idea that Hegel ends his two most important books, The Phenomenology of Spirit and The Science of Logic, the first one with the chapter on absolute knowing, and the second one with the chapter on the absolute idea. And on a superficial kind of reading, and in general, it's always a superficial secondhand reading, it sounds like what Hegel is saying is simply what he has said actually in other places, but I think the meaning of it is generally lost. Spirit is God thinking his thoughts, or God thinking God's thoughts, and that's the end of it. Ultimately, in very much more complex ways, that is in part Hegel's point. But in a sense, the way to get there is through the rendering explicit of a reflective reexamination of our current situation. And that always, as soon as we undertake that, is going to involve us considering where we've come from. Whether we do that on an individual level, or whether we do that as a member of a family, or as a member of a neighborhood, or in any kind of larger context, at any one of those starting points is going to immediately call on us if what we're undertaking is a reflective reexamination, the rendering explicit of a reflective reexamination is always going to open up the past, and so it's going to require of us to take a position on the past in the present. Okay. Can a reflective reexamination of the past produce a neutral or an objective account of the ethical values without reference to our contemporary social and intellectual milieu? Is there this? So my point that I think is compatible with Bauder's, and I think with a little bit more certainty that it's certainly compatible with Hegel and with Marx for that matter, is that we can't have this reflective reexamination of the past. We can't do it. That is, we who are here today can't do it by skipping out on our current values, the position we're in. It's just not doable. It doesn't even make sense. And so, okay, so I want to now point out in Bauder's book, I realized that Hegel's philosophy could provide the missing link to understanding how immigration relates to nationhood. The values that we hold here in Canada are connected, even when those I mentioned it last week. For Hegel, negation is a crucial consideration. So in Canada, anyone who's going to undertake this job of rendering explicit a reflective re-examination of the past, they're going to do it from here if they're here, and that's going to require taking a position either in favor of or against, and it's always going to be more complicated than that. It's going to be, well, I'm in favor of some of the things Trudeau does, and I'm against some of them, or I'm in favor of some of the values as I see the other citizens. We position ourselves against what we imagine to be the reality that we're surrounded by. And we can't help but position our own views against the views that we encounter in the rest of the world. So now I want to turn to Hegel and to Bauder's strategy in the 3 chapters that you were asked to take a look at. In one of the 3, in the 3 chapters, one of which you were to choose for the news analysis. It's a negation, a second negation, and then an overcoming of it. So I want to briefly take a look at negation in Hegel. In the preface to The Phenomenology of Spirit, a book whose awesomeness, whose greatness I could not overstate. And I encourage everybody to read this, although nobody I know in my world has ever undertaken that. But so lacking strength, I'll just read it. Lacking strength, beauty hates the understanding for asking of her what it cannot do. But the life of spirit is not the life that shrinks from death and keeps itself untouched by devastation, but rather the life that endures it and maintains itself in it. It wins its truth only when, in utter dismemberment, it finds itself. It is this power, not as something positive, which closes its eyes to the negative, as when we say of something that it is nothing or is false, and then, having done with it, turn away and pass on to something else. On the contrary, spirit is this power only by looking the negative in the face and tarrying with it. This tarrying with the negative is the magical power that converts it into being. So first, what tarrying means is spending time with, experiencing, enduring, staying with something. And what he means by the contrast between the negative and the positive, he's connecting the notion of positive not primarily in its sense of good, but from photography, which didn't exist in Hegel's day, and in a way doesn't even exist now, but it existed for a few minutes. Do you know what film, a black and white film, the way it produces a visual image for us is that there's a positive and a negative. And there is no image without both the positive and the negative. And it's that contrast that Hegel is working with. For Hegel, the positive and the negative can't possibly exist independently of each other, not as a matter of mystical commitment, the way this passage in a way suggests, but in a much more everyday sense that's captured by when you take a look at there's a photo, and the way the photo gets produced, like before your phone cameras, when it was a single lens reflex, I don't even know what the mechanics of it exactly are. With the camera with film, what happens is the aperture, so the way a camera would work is normally, so the camera has film in it, and the lens is closed. The light can't get in because the film, it's a piece of cellulose with chemicals that are photosensitive. When light hits those chemicals, the chemicals that receive more light react one way, and the chemicals that receive less light react in a different way. And the camera works by opening the shutter for a very brief moment. And in that moment, the light is hits the film, and then the camera, the shutter closes again, and the reaction stops. And what the camera captures is a certain amount of light hitting that film. And the way the film produces, what happens on the film then gets put in some chemicals that freeze that reaction at that stage, and a piece of paper, the plastic film produces a negative of the photo. And the way that negative turns into an image is by inverting the content of what is captured on the negative. What shows up as light turns to darkness. The chemicals in the film react negatively to the light, and then that negation is inverted by the chemical process of photography. So what we see in a like the picture that you buy when you have your film developed, is the negation of the negation. And it's in that sense, partly at least in that physical, real sense, that Hegel is talking about negation. And this tarrying is a little bit like, Hegel insists on the tarrying component of it, because in the same way as when we used to think of a photograph, or when we think about photography the way it used to be done, we think of the camera capturing an instant, but it's not accurate at all. It's the camera opens for 1/1000th of a second. It's not a long amount of time, but if it's for different sorts of photography, the shutter is going to stay open double, triple the time. And so in sports photography, for example, I forget now which way it works. I think that the shutter has to stay open long to capture something that's moving quickly, so that when a baseball, which travels, I'm not really sure what speed a baseball travels at, but with a camera, they could capture it as though it's frozen. I think it would open and close quickly. And it seems like it's an instant, but it's not. It's a measurable amount of time. The camera has to tarry with the light in order for it to actually produce some knowledge, in order for it to produce a photo. And the extent of that time of the interaction is determined by, and determines in turn, the amount of information on that photo and the kind of information that we can expect to get from that photo. Yeah.
In Bowder's case, negation refers more to national identity, or nation, whatever you want to call. The negation of negation, would that just be exploitation?
If it was simple, if it was just the negation of the negation, then it's just, it cancels itself out. But it's what Hegel calls it. I forget if Bowder identifies this or not, but Hegel called it a determinate negation. So not any old negation. It's a negation that's the work that the tarrying does, is to negate it in a particular way, in a way, in a particular way. So there's a negation, and then there's a determinate negation. The second negation. And the example is, what is a Canadian? A Canadian is a not American. But what is the content of that not American? And it's insofar as we can determine what that not American amounts to, such that a Canadian will identify as that. And so what we mean is we didn't invade Vietnam, or we don't have Ku Klux Klan parading in the streets as often, let's say, as the Americans do, or pick your own particular thing. But the stages through which this takes place is Canadian identity understood as a negation is we're not American. And the way this translates into social scientific knowledge is in the actual doing of it. And so it's certainly for people of my generation, and I'm not sure that it's quite as clear for your generation, partly because I'm not part of your generation. But for me, I'm exactly old enough to remember the Vietnam War. And I was very young when the Vietnam War started, but I can still remember watching the news. And in the United, just by coincidence, I had neighbors. Growing up, my best friend, he was born in Kentucky, and they came to Canada partly so that the children wouldn't be drafted. The dad got a job, but in part they took a job in Canada because they didn't want their kids to be drafted into the Vietnam War. And their oldest son was close enough to the age that they, that factored into their thing. So it was sort of on our radar. And the dad had served in the US military during the Korean War. And so it was a live thing. I mean, we didn't talk about it every day, but it was a live thing. But in Canada, there was, to the degree that what a Canadian identity amounts to, there was all kinds of disagreement, partly driven by the fact that politically and culturally, Canada's defined by several differences, but it was explicitly and reflectively defined by a linguistic difference between Anglophones in the rest of Canada and Francophones in Quebec. And so it was hard on the face of it to immediately say, well, Canada is like Germany, where everyone speaks German, or like France, where everyone speaks French. Neither one of those are literally an accurate claim, but they're very, 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 like there's a great deal of substance to that. In Canada, we didn't even have that available to us. It seemed important, it seemed crucial, and in a way it seemed true that there was a Canadian identity. There were Canadians, and we had a sense of identity, but it wasn't quite as immediately available what that could be. And so one candidate was, well, what we are is not Americans. And that would come up regularly, not just in everyday life. It would come up, let's say, in everyday life, but it would also come up in public policy and in the presentation of public policy through the media. The Canadian government was under pressure from the beginning. The US put pressure on the Canadian government to participate in the Korean War before it, which we did. But we never, well, the US never declared war on Korea either. A war was never declared. It was a military operation. Anyway, there was some name for it, but war was never declared. But when the United States invaded Vietnam and it increased the troop levels and so on, the United States looked for allies, and the Canadian government under Trudeau refused to join in on it, and even at some stages and to some degree criticized the United States for its effectively colonial war in Vietnam. And so starting in the 60s when Lester B. Pearson was prime minister, even under the previous prime minister before Pearson, it was Diefenbaker. Diefenbaker refused to allow the United States to have nuclear missiles in Canada for a variety of different reasons. Just to say that there's this longer arc where, for a number of reasons, Canada declined to participate, to collaborate with the United States in foreign policy. And that was made consistent with a certain understanding of what Canadian identity is. And it was framed in terms, and it was experienced in terms of, and it was described as, in part anyway, as a negation. Did you have a question? I'm sorry, that,
Negation is absence, determinate negation is kind of excluding, I guess.
well, that's an interesting, yes. Is negation an absence? A recent book was written, so a lot of, Slavoj Žižek is a Slovenian philosopher, and he wrote a book about Hegel's Science of Logic, and the title of the book is Less Than Nothing. And so absence in a certain complicated way is less than nothing even. Nothing is kind of neutral, but an absence that you feel is somehow generative of, and so in that way it's less than nothing. So it could seem like defining Canadians as not Americans, that we have to do it because or that we're doing it because there's no there. All we can do is describe the whole of the donut. I think that's an incomplete way of doing it, but certainly if you compare the negation to the second negation, then you do move from perhaps from an absence to, how did you describe it? An exclusion. I think about both of those, in both directions that works though.
Negation is more broad, like it can include a lot, but like just for this example, determinate negation would be more. So like we're not the US because we X, Y, Z.
Right, and the because though needs to be thought about a little bit more than that. There's two different. We can analyze this. We can think about this in two separate ways that, in practice, can't really be separated. How did we get here, and what does it mean now that we are here? And so it's 2023, and no matter why we did what we did in the past, it's still 2023, and in Canada, so Canadian international policy in 2023 is no longer like it was in the 1960s, even like it was in the 1990s. We're basically in lockstep with the United States. When they say jump, we just say how high. And there's no more why, there's nothing like that. We're locked in we still, from an identity point of view, insist on the differences. And one of the manifestations of that is, I think, accurately enough, it's inconceivable to most Canadians that we ever could have elected Donald Trump to be our leader. It's just completely impossible in our imagination. I think probably we're deluding ourselves a little bit, but I don't think we're deluding ourselves that much. I think it would be impossible for Trudeau to get elected president of the United States. One tiny example of this is Bill Clinton, when he was running for president, he avoided very strategically mentioning that he was a Rhodes Scholar. In Canada, people would be glad. I'm not sure what the currency of that is, though. Do you know what a Rhodes Scholar is? Sarah, do you know what that is?
No.
It's probably the most prestigious, or used to be. It's lost a bit of its shine, but it's one of the most prestigious undergraduate scholarships that's available. Cecil Rhodes, who was a white supremacist monster, millionaire, Rhodesia was named after Cecil Rhodes, but he was a high-ranking entrepreneur and then civil servant in England, and he established this Rhodes Scholarship, and lots of famous people eventually won Rhodes Scholarships, and Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar. So he went from Arkansas and he got a master's degree. I'm not sure if he ever finished it, but he studied at Oxford or maybe Cambridge. The Rhodes Scholarship is, you can have it either one or the other, but it's super prestigious. And in the United States, they're much more anti-intellectual still today than we are here in Canada. So this negation, the second negation is Hegel called a determinate negation because it focuses on some positive part of the negated thing. So it's not absolute negation, it's a determinate negation. What we are as Canadians is we're not Americans, but there's a specific part of what being an American is that we're denying or not, or repressing or changing. And the result of this determinate negation, as he puts it, is it converts it into being. So that's what we are as Canadians, is that in the reality, the effective reality, the cultural content of being Canadian, if we're trying to understand it. And remember, what the part, what I'm trying to elucidate here is this combination of rendering explicit a reflective reexamination. We want to better understand what it means to be a Canadian today. And we want to be able to explain it, not just experience it, not just feel it. We want to give an account of what that feeling is, of what that reality is. What is it to be a Canadian? Well, partly to be a Canadian is to feel like you're a Canadian. An account of that is going to have to include that. It's difficult, it's not easy, but that's the difficult task that both Trebilcock and Kelly on the one hand and Bowder on the other undertook in their respective books. And there's something at stake is demonstrated, is available to us as observers, that we're observers is a problem, and there's a chapter in the phenomenology about observing reason. But even if we arbitrarily position ourselves as observers, let's say we're skeptical about this, which is an important position to see at work in the social sciences, among other places. But if we want to see whether the extent to which this is true, over and over and over, the Prime Minister or the Minister of Justice or the Mayor or the public relations officer of a company is going to get up and they're going to articulate what it is that the company or the province or the city or the department is doing or has done or wants to do. They're going to articulate it in terms of those very things, of these kinds of commitments, these negated and determinately negated positions. The Canadian government will say, we're going to, last week we took a look at the news story of the Ukrainian workers who were invited over in Canada, and they are being harmed in the Ukraine, and they're good workers here in Canada. And both of those justifications are included in why we're accepting them and welcoming them even. Okay. You're welcome. So dialectic as an initial kind of account, just to get the ball rolling, positing, negating, reconsidering, positing, negating, reconsidering. So that this is kind of an indication of Amanda's question, isn't negation of a negation just a canceling out? When it is, it's not dialectic. And often that makes sense. Two forces will cancel each other out and there's no movement. And so in a certain kind of way in physics, and in part, Hegel was thinking about physics and he wrote about physics. The way I do this is I'm putting I mean, it doesn't look like this and it doesn't feel like this, but physicists know that this is what's going on. It feels like I'm just holding my arm out, but in fact, I'm pushing up on this marker with exactly the force that this marker is pushing down. When the force isn't balanced, my arm will go up. And when the force is unbalanced, my arm will go down. But in order to hold it out here, and in order to find that out, it's easy enough, but wait a few minutes, even a few minutes, just to, and never mind this, just hold your arms out. You don't have to hold up a marker or anything, just to hold your arms out for a while requires force. It's tiring. Initially, it doesn't feel like it. It doesn't seem like it, but that's because all kinds of stuff happens that we're not noticing, that we're not paying attention to. So when the negative and the positive cancel each other out, it looks like nothing's happening. And often it's because nothing's happening, but often it's because these two actions are counterbalancing each other. Okay, so this was supposed to be on click, click, click. So I'll just go through them all at once. So we see that the life of spirit now, so the life of spirit is not the life that shrinks from death and keeps itself untouched by devastation. One of the illustrations of one of the manifestations of the dialectic between the positive and the negative that Hegel comes back to over and over and over is the dialectic between life and death. And that manifests itself. Hegel following intellectuals and philosophers in his day, distinguished between a philosophy of nature and a philosophy of spirit and a sort of scientific philosophy. And the philosophy of nature is what we call science. And biology today operates very, very rarely using the vocabulary of dialectic, but the substance of what it studies is the polarity. It's organized around the polarity between the dead matter and the dead organic matter out of which life is assembled. When biologists in particular, but when scientists analyze any phenomenon insofar as it's alive, what they do is they break it down into the unalive parts. So that when they want to study embryology, they figure out, well, the concentrations of carbon, or I don't know the details of any of this, but when they'll take a look at the DNA, right? DNA, what's DNA? Does anyone know what DNA stands for?
I know it.
Deoxyribonucleic acid. So, and what it is, it's a bunch of carbons and sulfurs and all of this. And separately, they're not alive, right? A bunch of carbon. If you took DNA and you dropped it in acid or something, I don't know how they do these things, but they'll drop it and then they can figure out, well, it's 27% carbon and 18% whatever. And that's what scientists do when they study life. They break it, they take it down. And what is not life? It's dead, it's death, it's mere matter. And so, and physicists, when physicists study matter, there's negatively charged particles and there's positively charged particles. And at the edges of it, it's always been the case since before even what scientists were doing was described as science. There's always been non-science that operates at the edges of it. And even today, I have some friends who, in my view, are just wacky. And they actually, I'm going out too far on a limb here. There are lots of people who read into or who either read into or read out of, say, quantum mechanics as some indication of some spiritual thing. And for the most part, scientists, at least publicly, reject that. To a very, very great degree, privately, they reject it even more emphatically. But some small number of scientists are on board with this. They think that there is some higher kind of meaning to the scientific content of what they do, but they don't bother with that in their capacity as scientists. That's their, they see this connection, but it doesn't enter into their work as scientists. So that the cognitive and explanatory power of understanding contrast, absolutely or seemingly absolutely contrasting pairs of concepts is not merely found in the social sciences when they run out of other things to do. It's in biology, it's in chemistry, it's in physics, and it's in even arithmetic and mathematics. Equations operate by balancing the two sides of the equation. And so there's a widely reproduced kind of logic at work here that Hegel is trying to generalize to the greatest degree. So the life of spirit wins its truth only when in utter dismemberment it finds itself. And so, well, I went through that. That's the biology component. The truth of biology, the knowledge that biologists generate, what they're after, and that's become much clearer today than it was in Hegel's day. How do we understand life? We understand life in terms of interactions of DNA, which is itself understood in terms of its non-living but physical components. DNA, there's 20 amino acid bases, and they're all, I used to know this a bit better, not much better, but a bit better, and it's carbon and oxygen and nitrogen assembled according to the atomic structure of those three different elements. They have different patterns of electrons and protons that dictate how they can form bonds. And under the right circumstances, the bonds that those elements form allow those chemicals to manifest certain properties. And over 1 billion years on Earth, what happened was once about 5 billion years ago, as the planet began to cool, the water around the Earth formed an atmosphere, and the physical conditions that are required for some of these chemical reactions to take place over and over and over and over again came into place. And so we had a combination of atmospheric pressure and temperature and a proportional combination of the different elements that resulted in early versions of DNA molecules being able to reproduce themselves. And over time, under the pressure of evolution, we're here. That's 5 billion years worth of evolution that started out way back then, and it went from mere matter to life. And that, in part, that's what Hegel's saying. But the truth of this life, on Hegel's view, is one, it's the result of an effort that we make, not just to take it all apart, but to see how, when it's all combined together, it does what it does. And so when we say that being a Canadian is not being an American, that's a starting move. That's not the final say. Almost nobody, it's not a stable position to land on. Nobody feels that that's an especially insightful comment left on its own, unless you're just trying to piss off an American or even piss off a Canadian. Actually, you might succeed in doing it that way. So if you're looking for a reaction, maybe, But if you're trying to understand, that's not that's not an end point. That's maybe a beginning point. Okay, so now let's do that. Right, okay, so wait a minute, where did? So this carrying with the negative along with the positive as attentively as we can in their very opposition sometimes allows us to turn that very opposition into something, into an understanding of who it is. In the case here of the negation of the Canadian identity is the negation of being American. If we do this attentively, if we take a look at all at as many of the different factors as we can to see both what it isn't and what it is, and we see that together, then we can provide ourselves with some kind of cognitively helpful information that will connect us as, so in the case of Canadians trying to understand what being Canadian is, if we turn our attention attentively to this, we might be able to connect how we feel as Canadians to what we see and what we think and what other Canadians tell us they think it means to be Canadian, in connection with what Americans say it means to be American, and all of those other, and as you broaden it out, you have to see the linkages where they appear. This attentiveness is crucial. So so there are two components. There's attending to the negative in the context of the positive, and then there's also the reality of the contradictions that inhabit the that inhabit the content of all of these phenomena. The contradiction that I want to call to your attention in particular is the contradiction that Trebilcock and Kelly resist explicitly identifying. They contrast the view of liberty and the view of community as two core values that somehow coexist. But as ideas, I mean, they mention it, but they dance around it a little bit for a variety of reasons that I don't think need to attend to. But these two contradictory ideas, in fact, do coexist, but they coexist with great deal of difficulty, like positively and negatively charged particles in a chemical reaction. And if we want to understand what's going on, we need to understand the positive, we need to understand the negative, but if we really want to understand it, we have to understand them in their contradictoriness. That's how chemistry became a science, is that the way that elements combine to form molecules is as a consequence of one component of it is as a consequence of the covalent and bivalent bonds that form among them, positively charged electron shells and so on. I don't want to embarrass either myself or any of you who might know chemistry and I would have exposed myself as a chemical imbecile, but it's some version of that, right? What chemistry is, like it went from alchemy, where they were wearing pointy hats and they wanted to turn iron into gold, to actual knowledge. And that knowledge went through an understanding of the positive and negatively charged elements. And so, but it's in their contradictoriness that chemical knowledge it's of their contradictoriness that chemical knowledge of chemistry consists. And so from a Hegelian point of view, it's not good enough, and it's not a stable stopping point to say that there are these two core values, liberty on the one hand, community on the other, that coexist with great difficulty, that are contradictory, and also, and that's the background against which immigration policy happens. And what Bowder does is he tracks the news stories in terms of both of those tendencies, in terms of the liberty tendency, and the liberty tendency goes in two directions as well, and the community goes in two directions as well. There is an anti-immigration community perspective, and there's a pro-immigration community perspective, and there's an anti-immigration liberty perspective, and there's an and a pro-immigration liberty perspective. And how they combine into each other, how they go from a negation to a determinate negation to some so far ultimately unstable, but often at least more stable than the earlier version, is what Canadian history is made of, and what Hegel argued elsewhere, all of human history is made of. Right, and so the Bowder identifies Hegel's notion of negation and Hegel's dialectic as an intellectual resource that allows for and encourages a more complete understanding and a better knowledge of immigration policy, but he claims that there's a limit to it, and instead of adopting Hegel's views wholesale, he insists on what he describes as a materialist interpretation of dialectics, and he invokes a particular he invokes a specific intellectual tradition in European, well, in sort of Western, whatever Western means, thought, critical theory, and the names there are Habermas and Theodor Adorno, and there's a number of other thinkers who argued that, well, basically who argued that Hegel's ultimate commitment was ridiculous, and that Hegel was right, was correct, and Hegel's work is helpful up to a certain point, after which it has to be abandoned. And the name of that strategy is a materialist interpretation of dialectics, and it operates from an intellectual biography kind of point of view, an intellectual genealogy. This is what many people take to be Marx's transformation of Hegelian dialectic, rather than seeing the dialectic culminating in the idea with a capital I in Hegel, on Marx's, on the contemporary interpretation of Marx's interpretation of Hegel. The dialectic culminates rather in a materialist understanding of reality. And if we want to know why it is that there are these two core values, the correct strategy to get to that answer is to understand how these two different ideas, when they're put into, when they're made real, when they're realized in a society, further the interests of the further materially identifiable interests, which in a capitalist world always ultimately so far always corresponds to the interests of capital, largely speaking, big business. And in a certain way, that is the conclusion that Trebilcock and Kelly end on. Trebilcock and Kelly, although in the first chapter claim, they quote Keynes to saying early or late ideas always trump interests, and Trebilcock and Kelly sort of agree with that theoretical position. Nonetheless, as their chapters go, and then as their chapters go, they almost always demonstrate the extent to which, in fact, the ideas take a second place to the material interests. And in the concluding chapter, they more or less agree with that position. The trouble with that as an incomplete and I think even contradictory theoretical commitment in the book is that it almost forces us to ask the question, well, then what's the value of these ideas? Why are those values still around? Why are they still interfering with the resolution of the competing interests? And how are they doing that? At what point? And in a way, Bowder's goal is to demonstrate by looking at news media the way that imagination contributes to that. It's the medium through which these material interests are being advanced or failing to be advanced. If enough, so that obviously his book was written well before the Ukrainian situation happened, but if we follow the way the news covers the Ukrainian, the conflict in Ukraine, the Canadian imagination, I'll start over. Let me do this the other way. An analysis of a description, even of, it wouldn't even have to be an analysis, a description of the mainstream coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Ukraine's resistance and Ukraine's fighting back against Russia from a Canadian point of view, right? Because doing it from their point of view is important and helpful and interesting, but a separate thing. The Canadian response, which involves hundreds of millions of dollars and a great deal of effort in the context of a number of other pressing issues. Canada, the government had plenty on its plate prior to February 22nd or whenever it was that Putin invaded. Lots of things were going wrong. The government had Canadian government had lots of stuff it needed to get done and was in the middle of getting done. But when Russia invaded, Canada was immediately right on board in a super strong way. And it presented its position, and the position was picked up in the news media and by many, many, many different surveys in Canada, reflected widespread agreement, both with Canada's position and with Canada's justification for its position. Notwithstanding all kinds of contradictions that are easily identifiable, but that continue to be ignored. It's a blind spot in, on the one hand, the Canadian news media, and on the other hand, wide range of the Canadian population managed to miss this idea that my hand's actually pushing up on the marker. It's not that there's nothing there, that they're canceling each other out. It's not that there's no force. So this materialist interpretation, as a kind of side note, I think that Bowder's mistaken. I think Adorno is mistaken. Habermas is mistaken. And I think even Marx largely was mistaken about Hegel. I think that Marx fairly famously, I think nothing he said really is that famous anymore, but Marx described his own strategy. Marx called his logical strategy dialectic also. He invoked dialectic as the proper cognitive logic to apply to try to understand human society. And he acknowledged that he was using the term, a term that was inherited by German scholars in Marx's day from Hegel, but he said he turned Hegel's logic on its head. And whereas for Hegel, the top was ideas and the bottom was matter, this is Marx's claim about Hegel. Marx claims to turn Hegel around, and whereas he starts with ideas and he ends with material reality. I think Marx was just wrong about this. I think he misunderstood what Hegel said, and so I could go on about that exact thing forever, but I will spare everyone that. Okay. Now, I mentioned that this materialist interpretation of the dialectic, Bowder explicitly ties it to what's known in contemporary social science as critical theory, and that is basically the Marx minus revolution. It's the application of certain aspects of Marx's writings to all of the different areas of the social sciences. And that came to be known as critical theory through a fairly widely understood process. But Karen Eng, who is from Toronto, but she did her PhD at the New School in New York. She teaches, I don't know where she teaches now, but she's recently written a book on Hegel. And in an earlier article, writing about this very thing that I was just talking about, how to properly understand the relationship between Hegel and Marx, she wrote, in the attempt to demonstrate the actuality of freedom, it was Hegel who first turned from the Critique of Pure Reason, which is the title of a book that was very influential and remains very influential in philosophy, written by the German philosopher whose life covered, like Hegel. Immanuel Kant wrote a book called The Critique of Pure Reason. Kant, before Hegel, Kant was the most important German-speaking philosopher. And so the way it works is, to be the champ, you have to beat the champ. And so Hegel took on the champ. And rather than trying to articulate the requirements of realizing freedom in human life through a critique of pure reason, the way Kant did, what Eng is saying that Hegel does is to identify a critique of reason as it's embedded in social historical reality. And my claim is that, or what I'm trying to describe for you, is that in a certain way, Trebilcock and Kelly operate as though there are two competing ideas of pure reason, the idea of liberty and the idea of community, that exist somehow independently of the actual social and historical reality, which they spend most of their book concerned with. This party and the business group and the material and the actual day-to-day stuff, which is largely appropriately the subject matter that a law professor and Kelly, her work was in, she worked for the United Nations High Commission on Refugees. So she was an administrator for refugees and so on. Their primary concern in their daily, in the rest of their professional life was working through the details of this social and historical reality. But as the title of that article we looked at, interests don't explain everything. And that's true. And Kelly and Trebilcock, in their own backhanded kind of way, are stuck with that problem, that ultimately interests, even in Canada, fail to completely explain why every once in a while interests aren't pursued, and some version of that, those ideas are, we make sacrifices that can't be explained solely through our pursuing of our own understanding of our interests. Canada gives millions of dollars every year to people in countries who don't buy anything from Canada and from where, to whom very few Canadians are related. And we do it not because we have too much money, we say anyway, and I believe that to some degree it's true, we do it because they're suffering and we're human beings, and everything else remaining the same, feel badly about others suffering. So if we can help out a bit, we will. Not for any other reason other than when we can help stop suffering, we will. And that happens. But the point here is that that's not as a result of some pure reason, some level of an idea that exists only in pure reason. At least that's Eng's version of Hegel, and I think she's exactly right about that. And on that, basically everyone who likes Hegel and reads Hegel agrees with that part of it. The difference between Kant and Hegel. With Hegel, idealism effectively becomes social philosophy, and critique becomes inseparable from social critique. And the point I want to make, I don't think it occurred to me when I first made this slide, but here, this notion that, and I'm almost certain that Bowder and Treblecock wrote this, that the sentence wrote itself for them, and they didn't spend this much time thinking about it. But when they wrote earlier on, I'll have to go back to it now. We tried to avoid the temptation to be judgmental about their moral characteristics from the comfortable vantage point. And instead of this comfortable vantage point or the supposed enhanced susceptibilities of contemporary social and intellectual milieu, they want to talk about these core normative ethical values as pure ideas. And Hegel's point is you can't do that. You can't do that, and that's not what we do. We don't do it. We don't do it in isolation of that. We do them together, and they fit together sometimes better, sometimes not nearly as well. Sometimes we feel the pain and we're not sure it makes sense. Other times we don't do it, even though we know it's the right thing to do. We're helping the Ukrainians and we're leaving the Yemenis die. Babies in Yemen are dying, and we're not doing anything about it. I'm not doing anything about it, and I know that this is happening. Meanwhile, I had strawberries that went bad because I couldn't be bothered to eat them, and I'm throwing them in the garbage. And this is food that these children would, love to have, and they'll die because they didn't get it. And I bought extra strawberries to impress my friends when they came, whatever. I haven't had strawberries in a while, but somehow it just popped into my mind as an example. Okay, so now, I'm gonna have to jump over all of this. One example of negation that's available from Canadian history. This isn't in, I'm pretty sure it's not in Treblecock's book. Maybe it is. Anyway, I think I came up with this one on my own, so at least separately from that. So in 1867, the British North America Act set out the fundamental law of the newly established Dominion of Canada. In section 24 of the Act, so I'm not sure how well you two or the people out in asynchronous land, right? Canada has a bicameral legislature. In order for a federal law to pass, the House of Commons votes on it. And when it passes the House of Commons, it's sent to the Senate, and the Senate has to pass it as well before it gets sent to the Governor General. And when the Governor General signs it, the bill becomes a law. And in 1867, the British North America Act established the conditions for membership in the Senate. The Governor General shall select qualified persons to be senators. And in 1867, the problem was with the notion of qualified. Who's going to count as qualified? Well, right. Yeah, that's who it turned out to be. Of course, who else would it be? But in 1867, part of the reason so there was a Senate that was going to be composed of qualified persons chosen by the Governor General, and then there was the House of Commons that was elected. It was set up from the outset to be composed of representatives from all of the ridings, and they had to be men also, and they had to be they didn't have to be. I don't think that there was an explicit racial categorization of who qualified for legal standing, but there was a property requirement. You had to have a certain amount of money in order to vote and in order to present. But in 1927, so 40, 50 years go by, a petition was submitted to the Minister of Justice to determine if persons included women. And it didn't, it turns out. A case was had, and so in order to see what persons are, they had to determinately negate women. That's an example of one of the ways that we can see dialectic at work in human history. We weren't sure really what we meant by persons. And the way it worked, I mean, on the one hand, in order to understand this, we have to appreciate in a way that I think we can only do in an external kind of sense. And here the we is positional in itself in a dialectical way. I have to imagine my way back to a world where all men were even worse than we are today. And you do too, but there's a difference between you imagining that and me imagining that. We can all three of us and all of you can also do your best to do that, but it's not the same, it's not exactly the same imaginative task, right? We today, and by we in this particular instance, I mean me and you two and you people, are differentially positioned in our ability and what would be required of us to try to imagine our way back there. But so let's do that. Let's try to imaginatively work our way back to an officially white supremacist, explicitly patriarchal society where for a great deal of evidence exists that supports the claim that many, many, many women agreed with this view. Many didn't, and that they agree with it doesn't mean they liked it, and like it's more complicated than that, but it's worth understanding that it wasn't the case that every single man agreed with this, with every possible permutation of what this might mean, and that every single woman disagreed with every single permutation of what this might mean. So in 1927, now, God, it bugs me. Can't remember their names, but the 5 women known today as the famous 5, one of them was nominated by a province to be a senator, and she ultimately succeeded later, but it had to go to the Court of Appeal to determine what these words meant in the context of the Canadian Constitution.
Was it McKinney?
Wasn't her that I had in mind.
Well, I'm trying to get it.
Okay, that's all right. It's worse, not better, if you come up with it on your phone. So for me, I mean. Okay, so dialectic and Canadian sort of history. Okay, so now the person's case, the Judicial Committee overturns the Supreme Court reference and decides that women in Canada are persons. Right, so this is an example of a determinate negation. So persons through, so that At this point, we see a determinate negation. Persons initially don't include women, but the court, and in the public debate around this, and in the judicial argument for it, there was explicit reference made to how, well, in 1867, that's what people thought. But, it's 1929. We are modern people now, and we're not like our grandparents' generation, knuckle dragging backwards, et cetera, et cetera. Times have changed and we know better now. And we are better and we're different. And although, so the notion of persons that are only men has been negated. But that negation is a partial negation of it. Persons is not everybody. Persons doesn't include Indigenous women. It doesn't include, and women of Asian heritage and descent also were excluded. So that determinate negation doesn't reach all the way to, and today, never mind. I've got to get through more stuff. So, okay. So now, chapter 4 of the immigration dialectic. So we see the immigrant as other is always already the negation of the citizen. So the citizen is the us. So there's part of the background to Hegel's consideration is in the philosophical context. From a first person point of view, when I examine my own consciousness, and when each of you examine your own consciousness, there's my I for me, and there's your I for you, and then there's everything else. There's the world out there, and then there's the I, me. And then when I turn internally, so if I close my eyes, then I think of the breathing's still separate from me. That's not my I, that's an external thing. The I, whatever it is the rest of the world is not I. It's not this thing. They're connected. And if some of those things go away, I'm dead, or I'll stop experiencing my I. But there's also an us and a them. And both of those, so that the not I is the other of the I, and in a way that Hegel ultimately claims to be able to displace as the starting point. This was thought of as a possible starting point for a philosophical account of consciousness and reality. Hegel has a lot of difficult things to say about starting points. There's a great deal of disagreement about all of that. But if we get over the question of starting points, if we just begin, this is why I say it's always already. So from our point of view, if you start reading stuff that's already been written and you're trying to understand what it says without necessarily worrying about where it came from, just what is it saying? What it's saying, an immigrant, right? Just by the grammar of it means someone coming from somewhere else. Migrant is moving and they're from somewhere else. So an immigrant, by definition, is an other. And who they're an other of is the citizen. Again, by definition, the citizen is the other of the other. And in that context, what Bauder tries to demonstrate, and it seems to me that he demonstrates it very successfully. I'll just leave it at that. He demonstrates it very successfully. When you look at news stories, very, very often, his point is not that it's always like this. His point is that it's like this. That there are loads and loads of stories where what we hear about is the immigrant as an other. They're described in terms that don't comport with, that don't amount to the imagined content of our identity, in this case as citizens. Temporary workers versus we're not going to get there today. We're going to keep going. So the dialectic of identity formation of the self and the other, of us and them. It's through this kind of mechanism that the I becomes an us. The first us, anthropologically speaking, and biographically speaking, for most of us, is our family. So there's me, and when I remember, if I try to remember the first things back, my mom and dad are there in that memory. I don't have memories that don't include the world of my mom and dad, even if they're not in that memory. When I'm 3 years old, I never went anywhere unless my parents took me, right? It's not like I hitchhiked to Los Angeles when I was 3 years old. I wasn't anywhere near that cool. And we now know in a way that nobody discussed in Hegel's day anyway, our consciousness of ourselves as an I is preceded, at least arguably preceded by, in some ways, like it emerges, let's say. There's no evidence of our self-consciousness as an I at birth. We know enormous amounts now what's going on in the newborn brain, even in the brain in utero. There's absolutely no doubt that the brand newborn baby has a brain that's conscious and is thinking and doing all of those things. What we have no evidence of, and I don't think we ever will or could, there's no self-conscious I. It emerges through the child's contact with the world around it. The not I is the world, and the not I is the mother. But the baby forms a connection on some theories through, Freud. Yes, we'll skip some of these details. Eventually, the I forms itself in contrast from the us, but also part of the us. Both of those things come to determine the content of that I. And this us gets larger. So when you're 5 years old, when I was 5 years old, it would have been my mom and my dad, and I had two brothers when I was 5. And so us would have been them. But when I was 5, I also had friends next door and so on. And they were often part of us. And then, if I had a disagreement, then maybe, I hate you or whatever, it's a little looser. But nonetheless, that us when you're 5 years old includes a broader circle, and it moves out. It's not as though, well, not when I was 5 anyway. When I was 3 or 4, John Kennedy died, and there's this very famous photo of I think it was his son, but it might have been his daughter saluting. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but at the funeral, the little kid was saluting. Well, I think it's cute, and sad for sure, but I don't think any serious person really associates the content of that salute with the content of what adults and even maybe 11 and 12-year-olds can feel as real patriotism. The little kid is dressed up, right? And he's wearing a suit, but it's not like he's at lunch from a business meeting. He's wearing a suit. He's dressed up as though he's a human, as though he's a member of a reflective, active member of that community of people who could salute the flag and so on, and who could think of Kennedy, for whom Kennedy was the president, not dad. And even, at 5, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure they have no idea about death or anything like that. They could see mom's sad and everyone's acting super weird, and people are talking about this thing. But I don't even think at 61 we really have any idea about death, but that's a more complicated, separate problem. For sure, we have an us, we have an I, and we have an us, and the us includes the them. So when I was 5 years old, I wasn't allowed to cross the street on my own. So I had friends on my side of the street, and I didn't know the kids on the other side of the street. I knew them to look at them, and they didn't go to the same school as I did, so they were them. And 60 or 55 years later, I have no idea who they were. I still remember the names of some of the people who lived next door to me, and I have memories of them. They were part of us, and then on the other side of the street, it was them. And then that is constitutive of who us is, in the same way as the immigrant and the other is constitutive of who we are. But then what we get is we have the possibility of overcoming that. And so in 1990, maybe, I forget what year it was, but when Nelson Mandela was released from prison in South Africa, one of the first, I think the first place he went to was Cuba, because Cuba was the South Africa, that was the Black community in South Africa's best friend, and Cuba was the strongest opponent of apartheid after the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union was done at that point. But Mandela's first trip was to Cuba to thank Castro and the Cuban people, but he came to Canada before he went to the United States. And I'm not sure that it was on his first trip to Canada, but I think maybe his second trip to Canada, he was given Canadian citizenship as a gesture. He, who legally was one of them, but because he corresponded for all kinds of reasons that are good and bad, he corresponded very effectively with who it is we wanted to think of ourselves as. Nelson Mandela, the Nelson Mandela that we welcomed, all of us but one member of parliament refused to stand because Nelson Mandela, the South African, what was the name? What was the name of his party? Anyway, they were allied with the South African Communist Party. And when Mandela was in the early 1960s, the African Congress Party, anyway, whatever, they were closely allied with the Communist Party of South Africa, and they were also actively involved in armed struggle against the apartheid regime. And Mandela was convicted of some armed thing, like they were trying to kill him, and he was fighting back. So one member of the Conservative Party, I think it was Otto Jelinek, but I'm not sure. Imagine I can remember his useless name, but anyway, he wouldn't stand. And it was good that he wouldn't stand, at least for the purposes of my explanation here of a dialectic. There's this residual otherness that's always available out there for us so far. Okay, I guess that we're at the end of this. Right, that's the right quote. This practice of national identity formation through negation involves so that Nelson Mandela coming in and being included as a negation of the negation. But this practice of national identity formation through negation involves the construction of impassable symbolic boundaries. Here he quotes Stuart Hall, a Trinidadian English cultural theorist who's dead now, but very influential in the 90s. So the national identity formation through negation homogenizes diverse immigrant populations as outsiders, distinguishing them from those who belong to the nation, and then fix these binary identities. Stuart Hall, Trinidadian, pretty sure he's from Trinidad. He's from the Caribbean anyway, Black man. And in the UK in the 1960s, like in Canada, for many of the same reasons, there was an exodus of people from the Caribbean islands, and many of them went to the UK. Many of them went to the UK, especially from, I don't know enough about the geography of the Caribbean, but in a lot of the islands in the Caribbean, they had the English education system, and it was so that their schooling credentials applied in England directly. And so the top scholars, the students with the top grades in many of the Caribbean islands got scholarships to go to the better universities in the UK. And Stuart Hall was brilliant. And so he had great grades and he got a scholarship. But top students at university get to experience this the symbolic construction of these boundaries in all kinds of ways. Stuart Hall, although he was middle class in is it Jamaica he's from? So he's from Jamaica, sorry. He was middle class in Jamaica, but on a scholarship at Oxford or wherever it is he went, he's not middle class anymore. He's poor and he's black and he's brilliant. And being brilliant makes it in a way worse, not better, because then you're forcing the other people in your group to recognize that you can't be part of them, not because you're a dumbass, but because they're racist. And it's much easier to see yourself as part of an exclusive group because of your qualities rather than because of some feature of the other, especially when it conflicts with your widely believed view of yourself. So the symbolic nature of these boundaries is not meant, it places a great deal of weight on symbolic boundaries. This is not meant to say that they're imaginary in a fake way. It's to say that these boundaries enter into our imagination in ways that pervade our perception of the world, and especially our perception of the social world. And so we're made into Canadians by recognizing that we're not Americans, or we're made into Canadians by recognizing we're not from China, like in 1910, or Komogata-Maru, where we're not from India. They're not really members of the Commonwealth, no matter what they say. That's not true. We know what us looks like. We know what us really is, and it's not them. And so these boundaries, these fixed binary identities, because they're in the imaginary, become difficult to identify and difficult to get rid of. But it's doable. And that's determinate negation sometimes involves transforming these binaries through other symbolic actions and activities. Having Mandela come to Canada, having Mandela become an honorary citizen, like Malala, what's her name? Malala Yousafzai. Anyway, she also, I think, was given, the other bad example, though, is Aung San Suu Kyi, who was given Canadian citizenship, and then we took it back when it turned out we didn't like her anymore. But by recognizing Nelson Mandela as a Canadian citizen and explicitly connecting his Canadianness, his sort of honorary Canadianness, to his participation in the struggle against apartheid, actually, I think, does this symbolic work to change who it is we see ourselves as. And so the dialectic operates that way. Okay, so I will pick it up from here, and I will post that description of the final component of the assignment, and I will track down what's involved in getting full access to that Adobe thing. The post is, yeah, the article is there with the comment in the folder week 10. Okay. Okay, yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, so now. Okay, so Nicholas asks, will news analysis 2 be assigned this week as well? Class reflection paper. Yes, I'll talk about that next week. Okay, let me check that. I thought it was out there. You're welcome. Have a good week. Okay, Nicholas, I'm checking on what you asked. Uh-oh. Right, yes, okay, so news analysis 2 will be, I'm gonna make it public in an hour. So it will be assigned. And then Miriam asks class reflection paper and news analysis 2. So news analysis 2, I'm gonna make available in an hour, within an hour, it'll be available. And the class reflection paper is going to be available next week, and I'll talk about that at the beginning of class next week. Does that answer your question, Nicholas and Mariam, if you're still there?
Yes, just I have a question about the discussion board. The due dates is different in migrate tab and discussion board. Like in discussion board number 4, it's the in migrate tab it says March 26, but in discussion board tab it says April 12. I don't understand.
Okay, so sorry,
exactly.
I will fix that right now. April, whatever the April one is the right date. So let
It
me
is
go.
April 12, I think so.
There's a class in here now, so I'm gonna have to go. I'm gonna go to my office and I'm gonna fix that now,
Yeah,
okay? Sorry
I
about-
emailed, I emailed, but I didn't get any response. I emailed all of the mistakes. Yeah, just I
Okay.
want to fix it up.
Okay, so I'm sorry, but the class is coming, so I've got to go.
It's okay, no problem. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.